All right, guys, Lewis here. If you're trying to learn a language, and specifically for this interview, we're going to talk about pronunciation. So, for those of you guys trying to improve your pronunciation and trying to, speak with a better accent, because maybe you're an adult learning a language, then this interview is going to be really interesting. So, Tracy, I'm just going to let you introduce yourself and also try to convince the listeners of why they should listen to your advice when it comes to pronunciation.
Okay. Well, I've been around for a very long time, so I have lots of experience, so they could listen to me just given that I've been in the field for so long. My name is Tracey Derwing, and I'm a professor emeritus from the University of Alberta, and I'm also an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. When I was a graduate student in psycholinguistics, I was teaching at nighttime to support myself, and I taught adult newcomers to Canada in an ESL program, and that had a profound effect on me, and it shaped what I ended up doing for my PhD, which was looking at how native speakers differ in communication skills when talking to learners. And there's a big range there, it turns out. But also, I ended up teaching pronunciation quite a bit in that period. I ended up teaching pronunciation along with some of my fellow teachers, one of whom was Murray Monroe. And Murray and I were both studying linguistics at the same time. We ended up being really curious about pronunciation, and we developed a long time working program where we worked together on pronunciation issues.
Right. And I just want to ask because it seems like a lot of people are struggling with pronunciation. And obviously, for me, coming from a French speaking country, I see a lot of French speaking people really struggling with English, although, the two languages are somewhat close. But in terms of, pronunciation and all this, it's kind of far apart. Uh, I I'm not really sure why it is that people struggle with pronunciation, but I suspect, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like simply the main issue is that they're not focusing on pronunciation at all. We're learning about grammar, we're learning about vocabulary, but we're not doing a lot of dedicated practice when it comes to
Yeah,
improving our accents.
well, I'm sure that contributes to it for people who do struggle. There's a real range, though, in terms of individual differences in aptitude for pronunciation. So lots of people are really good right from the beginning, and have really very good pronunciation to start with, whereas other people really struggle. Um, so I think that makes it more challenging for teachers because they want to do things that are going to help everybody in the class. And if some of the people in the class don't really need it, then, they don't want to be wasting their time working on pronunciation. So, in the sense that everybody has to learn grammar, everybody has to learn vocabulary, but not everybody needs to work on pronunciation. For the people who need it, though, it's a real problem because, if you can't communicate your intended message, you're in big trouble. So you can have excellent vocabulary skills and grammar and so on, but if you can't communicate your message and people don't understand you, then you're nowhere, right? So pronunciation is really crucial, but not for everybody. And I think that that's part of the problem. There are such individual differences.
Right, I see. I I want to ask the question first early in the interview because I suppose a lot of people are wondering, should I even bother with trying to improve my pronunciation? So I'm going to formulate a more accurate question. So, is it possible, in your opinion, looking at the research that we have, to uh, work on your pronunciation as an adult learning a language and then
Oh,
end up sounding
absolutely.
like a native speaker?
Well, it's highly unlikely that people are going to sound completely native like.
Uh,
What you need is to sound highly intelligible. That is, people understand exactly what it is that you're trying to say, and you want to be easy to understand, and that's comprehensibility. So, somebody can be intelligible and still the listener has to really focus to understand what they're trying to say. Well, you don't want that. You want somebody to be really comprehensible, easy to understand, fully intelligible. But if people run into problems, when they're talking to somebody else and they find that they're having to repeat themselves regularly and they're having noticeable problems with pronunciation, then for sure they should try and get help, because pronunciation instruction, if it's done appropriately, can be really effective. And we've done several studies where we've shown that, where people given a very limited intervention can improve significantly, where listeners really notice the difference. So, can pronunciation instruction make you sound like a native speaker? Probably not. I mean, that's very, very rare where people who learn a language as an adult can sound like a native speaker. It can happen, but it's really rare. The goal should be highly comprehensible, highly intelligible speech. But there are things, about our physiology really that affect learning, right? So Janet Worker, a professor at the University of British Columbia, she and her colleagues showed that babies really react right away to the ambient language, the language of their mother and the people around them. And they start ignoring sounds that are not part of their L1 in very early months, right? And ultimately, that makes it easier and faster to learn your L1, but it makes it harder to learn sounds and prosody in a second language, going down the line. So we're just kind of programmed early on to really focus on our first language. So that's a little bit of a barrier. And then, Flagey, Monroe, and Mackay did this wonderful landmark study years ago in 1995, where they looked at immigrants to Canada who came from Italy, and they came at different periods in their life. So they looked at people who came in their first year, their second year, their third year, up to about, I think it was 21 or 22 years of age. So they had these categories of people. Then they looked at whether or not they had accents. And sure enough, people who came after the age of 4 started to have accents in their English, even though they were raised in a native-speaking environment, right? So and there was nobody who came after puberty who didn't have an accent. So part of this is biological, right? It's different from some other aspects of language learning, because some of this is actually biological. However, that said, lots of people learn a language as an adult and they are highly successful. So, we just need to accept that some things are inevitable, but there's no question that people can improve their pronunciation.
Today I want to talk about a language learning platform called italki that I have been using for years. Now, if you're learning a language, it's really important to get targeted feedback from a native speaker or teacher to really know what is going wrong with the way that you speak, the way that you use the language. And with italki, you can get one-on-one personalized lessons with native teachers to improve your listening and your speaking skills. And italki has more than 30,000 teachers worldwide. And also you pay per lesson, so there's no subscription at all. And you can learn anytime and anywhere as long as you have your desktop or your laptop or your mobile device. You can have a lesson.
出身はどこで？
第一出身なんだけど。
そうなんです。第一出身でずっと住んでい
ます。そうですね。大学に行った時は、スイスに来ました。
そうなんですね。最近実は私もスイスに旅行に行って、
そうですか。
すごくいいところでした。
そうですか。
すごく住みたいと思うぐらい好きです。
So you guys know that I do a lot of language learning on my own, but honestly, there's no good replacement for a good teacher. So you can click through the link below in the description to start your language learning journey with italki. And also you can buy $10 worth of credit to get $5 worth of credit for free if you use my exclusive promo code Lewis2025. But this discount is only going to be available for the first 50 users. So try it now and start your 2025 language learning journey. Right, and I definitely think that this should be the main objective for people, just being intelligible and getting people to understand you. I guess, if you really want to sound like a native speaker, I mean, the question is really why. I guess if you're a spy, maybe, or if you're an
A spy or
actor,
an
then
actor.
yeah,
An actor. Like those are really the two professions where it would be handy to be able to sound like a native speaker, but really there isn't much else.
even
And as long as you're, easy to understand, I mean, people forget that they're talking to somebody who has an accent. You stop noticing it, right? After a while, if you get to know somebody, that's just the way they talk. And it's part of your identity, and it's not a big deal. It's only when, you know, conversations start to be impacted by an accent, then it's a problem.
right. And just as a funny anecdote, I was watching about a week ago, it was Mission Impossible with Tom Cruise. And in this particular volume of Mission Impossible, there was also, what's his name? Henry Cavill, the British actor. And
Yeah.
he was supposed to play an American like CIA agent. And I just thought, sometimes the way he says things, he's obviously not American. So just, as a little anecdote, even for British actors, it's hard to like impersonate
Yeah.
an American person. But
When it
yeah,
goes the other way, like there's a movie, what was it? It was Kevin Costner in Robin Hood. This was years and years ago. It is the worst accent ever. Like he's an American playing a Brit, right? And oh my goodness, it's just awful. And it's really worth watching. I mean, sometimes I showed little clips in my own classes because I wanted people to see how difficult it is, even when it's the same language, right? It's just a different dialect.
right. I want to talk about specifically the steps that people can take to improve their pronunciation. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the studies because I'm really curious as far as when you do, and I realize there's a wide array of studies going on, but when you're trying to evaluate the efficacy of a certain intervention for improving pronunciation, uh, what are how are these studies designed really? What is happening?
Okay. So when we do an intervention, I'll tell you about a particular study that we did, but the format is similar in terms of how we do the evaluation. But my colleagues and I were approached by a window factory, and the executives said that they were concerned about some of the people in their company who had been promoted time and again, and with each promotion, they needed to use English more,
Mhm.
and it was starting to be a real challenge, right? Because they had pronunciation difficulties. The average length of time that these people had been in Canada was 19 years. So they had been exposed to English a lot for 19 years, right? And had been working in English all that time, but they really struggled. So most of them were Vietnamese. One was Cambodian, which is a similar language, right? And they asked us, the executives asked us to do an intervention. So we did, and it was only 17 hours total, but it was spread out over about 3 months. And also, they had to promise to do listening homework every night, which their teacher designed for them. So their teacher was Jennifer Foote, who's now an academic who works in pronunciation. But she was an instructor at that time, and I worked with them one on one a little bit as well. So, what we would do is we would collect language samples from them initially before we did the program. And then we collected the same kinds of samples afterwards. And then we would take parts of those samples from before and after, randomize them, and then we had listeners who would listen to these samples of speech and rate them for comprehensibility. And so that's how and we had them rate for fluency and for accentedness as well. And so they would do these ratings, and then we could separate out the befores and the afters and look to see whether there was a difference. And in this case, every person improved. There was a statistical difference, right? So it was noticeable to listeners that these people had improved with only 17 hours of actual contact time, but they also had been doing quite a lot of listening homework that was specially designed for their problems, right? And they were starting to notice, like, even in the latter classes, they would start correcting each other, right? So they were really noticing things that they had never noticed before. So listening is important, but it needs to be directed listening, where a teacher can determine where there are problems that are going to interfere with intelligibility or comprehensibility, and then direct the attention of the learners to those areas. Sometimes you have to explain how to produce a sound.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you have to work on getting people to notice. Like, noticing is just absolutely key. So that's how you can determine whether there's been improvement or not. Now, our participants, they felt that they'd improved too, and some of the staff who worked with them really noticed a difference.
Right. Talking about feedback, this is, I think I want to talk about this because a lot of people listening to this interview are going to be people most likely learning languages on their own. And the one thing that they're probably lacking is feedback, not just in terms of pronunciation, but, just in terms of their language use. And I know that a lot of people are very reluctant to hire tutors or teachers, but just in terms of pronunciation, how important do you think is feedback from an actual person?
Well, I think it's really important, and I think that's a big problem for a lot of people, because ideally, the best thing to do would be to find a teacher who knows what they're doing, a teacher who has had training in how to teach pronunciation. Because one of the things you need to determine is what matters to intelligibility. What is it that the student is doing that is interfering with their productions, that makes them hard to understand? So you sort of have to assess that. And if you don't know anything about teaching pronunciation, that can be difficult to do. So there are lots of people on the internet who call themselves accent coaches, but in fact, and they say that they have all this success and great training and everything. A lot of those places are just scams, and and they can actually make you sound worse. And so if you can find a teacher who has training in how to teach pronunciation, that is the ideal. But if you don't have that, there are other options. Like, what you could do is see if there's somebody who wants to learn your L1, and you can trade lessons and get at least some basic feedback
Mm-hmm.
from somebody who's a human. Now, there are apps that can help you with some things, right? So, for instance, you talked to Ron Thompson, so you know about the English accent coach. So if there are particular vowels or other segments that you have difficulty with, you can get some feedback that way. He's focusing on perception, and obviously perception is really crucial. You need to be able to perceive a sound in order to produce it. So if perception is something that is causing you some difficulties, then for sure an app like English Accent Coach will be effective, because you'll get feedback on your perception. And he has shown that improving perception can lead to improvements in production as well. So that's at the segmental level. It's harder when we start talking about suprasegmentals, things like intonation and stress and speech rate and so on. Those things are harder, and really it's easier if you have a human giving you some feedback on those. And there are some websites now that claim that they help you with your pronunciation and claim that they're going to improve your pronunciation to the point where you can even sound like a native speaker, but that's really not the case. So, for example, there's an app called Gliglish, and it's in lots of different languages. They offer it in many different languages. It's AI based, and you can have a conversation with an AI tutor. And I think it's like fantastic for developing fluency and probably for enhancing grammar and vocabulary. But a colleague of mine and her colleagues, Shannon McProcklin, she carried out a study recently on Gliglish, and it's not very helpful in terms of pronunciation. I think that's going to improve over time, but right now it's not there. It's still much better if you can access a human.
Right. Yeah, this I've definitely seen this. I mean, there are lots of apps and websites claiming that, they use Google's speech recognition technology or whatever, and lots of false positives, lots of false negatives, and the feedback is just very general. It's not really targeted, I found. So,
Right. And what you really need is somebody who's going to say, here's what you're not doing right. This is what you're doing. This is what you need to do. And let's work on that and get you to that stage where you're producing it so that it's intelligible.
So you mentioned three options in terms of getting feedback. First is a teacher who is trained in teaching pronunciation, which I suspect is somewhat hard to find for a lot of people. Second option is a sort of language partner. So I'm assuming a native speaker of, let's say, if I'm learning Japanese and I find a Japanese person who wants to learn my native language and we exchange like this. Third option is the apps, which are not, fully developed at this point. I personally like the second option, talking. That's what I do about 5 to 7 hours a week. I talk with Japanese people on the internet, and some of it is pronunciation practice. Uh, do you think this is a very good option? Because I mean, I realize that as a native speaker, they're going to see. I mean, they're going to hear my mistakes, but at the same time, they're not really trained in teaching pronunciation. So, do you think this is a problem?
Well, it's better than nothing for sure, because first you can set some ground rules. I mean, one of the problems with people who aren't trained teachers is that they don't want to correct you if I mean they don't want to interrupt a conversation
Uh-huh.
if and they want the flow to be there, and they don't want to be interrupting you all the time, and they worry about criticizing somebody or correcting somebody, right? They don't want to correct. Yeah, like people are reluctant to correct other people. So if you set some ground rules at the outset saying, look, I want you to correct my pronunciation. I want you to interrupt me. I want you to do this, and I'll do the same for you. If you have that agreement, then that's going to be helpful, because you'll notice a pattern after a while of the same kinds of errors that they notice, and you can start looking elsewhere for help
Mhm.
if they can't help you with a listen and repeat kind of thing. Then you can start looking yourself for some possible solutions, but at least that helps you know where you're having communication breakdown, right? Where the problems are. So it's helpful in that respect. And we know that pronunciation can improve on its own over a long period of time if you continue to have complex conversations in the language that you're learning. So we did a longitudinal study where we looked at people who did not get any pronunciation instruction. They came to Canada when they were well, they had been in Canada for about 3 months when they started the study. They were all relative beginners in learning English. They'd all studied some English in their home countries, but hardly any speaking or
Mm-hmm.
listening. It was almost all just reading and writing. So anyway, they were beginners when they came, and we tested them, I think 6 times in the first year. We tested them at the end of the second year, at the end of their 7th year in Canada, and then again at the end of their 10th year. So we really had a good picture of their pronunciation development over time. And when we did the 10th year data collection, we compared that to all the other times. But what we were really interested in was whether there was ongoing improvement between year 7 and year 10. And I should tell you, too, that we also interviewed them each time. So we had a really good idea of how much English they were using over the course of a normal day. And what we found was that there were some people who, in the absence of any pronunciation instruction, continued to show significant improvement between year 7 and year 10, but they were using English in complex ways all the time, at work or in other ways. There were other people who actually regressed, so their
Right.
pronunciation got worse. And there were a couple of people who went back to being at the same level that they were when they started, 10 years before, because they weren't using English very much. They were able to find other ways. They didn't have to communicate very much in work, at their work, and they could do a lot of it through writing. They relied on their spouses.
Mm-hmm.
They had other ways of living their lives without really using very much English at all. And they actually got worse. So there was a lot of up and down over the years. But I mean, the the good outcome is that it's a matter of use it or lose it. So the people who continued to use their second language in a really meaningful way continued to improve without any effort. They
Mm-hmm.
weren't getting any instruction whatsoever, but they were continually improving over time, at a much slower rate than they were improving early on. Like, Murray and I have talked about the window of maximal opportunity. And for us, that's the first 6 months or so that you have massive exposure. We notice that people are most malleable in terms of their pronunciation in that first 6 months. And that's really when a lot of pronunciation instruction should happen, but it doesn't. For reasons that we've already discussed, most people don't get pronunciation instruction when they first arrive. But that would be really optimal if they could get some pronunciation instruction on arrival. However, even without any instruction, if you continue to use the language, you're going to continue to improve. So it's never too late. I mean, it's better if you could get some help earlier, but it's never too late. And interventions work really late. So, like the window factory people, that they had been in Canada on average 19 years. That's a long time. And they improved significantly with a short intervention. And, we went back and did a delayed post-test with those people 3 months after, and they had continued to improve. Like, once we stopped the instruction, we were worried, oh, maybe they'll backslide. But no, they actually got better in terms of their comprehensibility after we quit the intervention, 3 months before. So it is a use it or lose it proposition. You just keep at it, and you'll continue to make improvement.
And so, in terms of you mentioned that ideally you should get pronunciation instruction early on. It has to be early on, or ideally it should be early on, because then is it that if you don't get this instruction, then you start using the language in ways that are, with the wrong pronunciation patterns, and it sort of stays that way in the long term? Is that the reason? Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so these patterns get entrenched, right?
Right, right.
And I think Ron mentioned to you that, you might um, mispronounce a high frequency word that you learned really early on, and then you can learn some new words much later, and those words may have some of the same segments that you mispronounce in that high frequency word, but you pronounce the new word better, right? Because you've learned it when you've got more capacity. Uh, but those old words stay mispronounced for a very long time. So it's just better if you can sort of address the issue as early as possible. So, for example, one time I was doing some testing for another colleague at a language school. I was just helping out, but this young woman came and I assessed her, but she was a Spanish speaker and she had really noticeable epenthesis. So what that means is that, when in English, when you have a word like school, she would say school, and spoon would be spoon. So anytime that there was a word initial S followed by a stop, she would insert an vowel. Um, and that's because that's a phonological rule of Spanish. They say España where we say Spain, and they say escuela instead of school, right? So these are all related words, but they have to have that there. They're not allowed to have a word initial S followed by a stop. So hers was really noticeable, and I found it really distracting. And I thought, oh, I said to her, do you mind staying for 5 minutes after we finish this testing? Because I want to talk to you about something. And she said, fine. So I explained to her what she was doing. We practiced and talked about what epenthesis was and what was happening there. And I said, I want you to try to say these words without that vowel there. So we worked on it for a little while. It only took 5 or 10 minutes, and she could do it just fine. She had no problem saying Spain or school or spoon. She could do it. She just needed to be told, right? So I said, how long have you been studying here? And she said, 3 months. And I said, has any teacher said anything about this to you? And she said, no, nobody said anything. And it's like, well, that's too bad, because I found it really distracting, because she used a lot of words that began with an S and a plus a stop. And so it was really disruptive. And it was so easy for her to do without that epenthesis, but somebody needed to tell her. And that's a problem. Like we do need to have more trained teachers who understand how to assess what's going on. There are other problems that are, or I shouldn't say problems, there are other things, segments, let's say, that people may substitute where it really makes no difference at all. So, for instance, a lot of people, when they are learning English, don't have interdental fricatives in their own language. So, th and the. Okay, so sometimes they'll substitute a the, like in the word the, they'll substitute a D. So they say the instead of the. Well, it makes no difference, right? It's just so easy to understand, and anybody can follow it. It's predictable. It's no big deal. So why would you waste time working on that when you might have some other problem, like with a vowel, that is going to cause real problems for the listener, right? But I just feel like we need to have are more teachers who can identify those aspects of an accent that are going to cause problems for listeners, and focus on comprehensibility and intelligibility. Don't worry about other differences that aren't going to affect meaning at all.
Right.
So it's a matter of priorities, right?
Yeah, this is This is definitely interesting, and I'm definitely guilty of this as well. I mean, talking with Japanese people, and I realize that sometimes I need to correct their pronunciation, but sometimes, I mean, usually I talk to them, after work. It's like 6, 7 p.m. And sometimes, they say things, they're really trying, but I mean, I'm just like, where do I start? There's so many things, vocabulary issues, grammar issues, and then there's pronunciation. So it's not really ideal, but yeah, definitely they need someone to tell them at least once, and then they can self-monitor. I want to talk about something that we haven't talked about up until now. It's pretty obvious that listening plays a big role in improving your accent because you need to, I'm assuming, improve your perception first. But we haven't talked about reading, and my idea here is that perhaps if you learn to read and you read the language and you associate sort of the written form with how you can pronounce the word, then maybe if you're good at reading, then it can help with pronunciation. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think reading is fantastic for development of vocabulary and grammar, but I think mostly reading isn't very helpful for pronunciation unless if you do have a text and you have an audio version of that same text, that could be very helpful. So if you're listening to what you're seeing on the page, that that can be very helpful because you're going to come across words that you don't know how to pronounce. And if you're listening to it on audio at the same time, that could be very useful, you know, and even, well, and especially with English, right? Because English has got somewhat odd spellings, right? And even native speakers often mispronounce words that they've read because they haven't heard them. So, if you think of a word like chasm, which is spelled Chasm, I've heard people say chasm, and obviously they've only read the word and they've never heard anybody say it, or they haven't recognized that that's what somebody was talking about if they said chasm. Uh, so if you have an audio recording that goes directly along with the text, then I could see some benefit for pronunciation. But if you're just doing silent reading, no, I don't see any help offered by reading. Now, some people say that they think reading aloud is a good idea for developing pronunciation, but um, if you're not getting any feedback, I don't think that's going to be helpful either,
Mhm.
especially in English, because the spelling is so weird, right? Like some languages where the orthography and the sound system are really transparent, maybe it would be helpful to practice reading aloud a little bit. Like Finnish apparently is
Really?
completely
Okay.
transparent, but not English. It's not a good
Yeah,
idea for
definitely not.
English.
French, same thing. I mean, it's so
Yeah,
weird.
French is not good either. So yeah, it's listening is better than reading for
Okay,
sure.
right. Yeah, I want to talk about a specific technique that I sometimes get asked about, and I haven't really used it too much. It's shadowing. I don't know if there's any research on shadowing. What do you think of it in terms of pronunciation?
Yeah, shadowing is a very helpful technique. So the, I just want to mention a website where people can read about some of these things because this website was developed by John Levis. It's called pronunciationforteachers.com. So the pronunciation for teachers is all one word.com. And it's a website that has short, easy to read essays about some of these techniques and about some of the other terms in pronunciation research. So shadowing is when people try to follow a model as fast as they can, and produce that model in the same way as make their own productions match what the model is saying. Now, there's a related technique called mirroring, and I think mirroring is probably even a bit more effective. So with mirroring, students pick a model. They pick somebody who they want to sound like, who they want to emulate, right? Somebody whose language skills they appreciate. And then they watch a video of that person and they transcribe exactly what that person said, but they also look at the gestures, they look at the facial changes and so on, and they try to mirror that individual. So when they transcribe the passage that they want to copy or mirror, they mark where the stress is. They break things out into thought groups. They try to give themselves some special clues or reminders as to what to do when they mirror that person. So then they use that and they look at the video again and they try and emulate that person by making the same gestures and speaking exactly the same way. And there was a person named Colleen Myers who did several studies as a part of a mirroring project. And she found that this was a really effective way to help people sound more like people that they admired. And it doesn't have to be another native speaker, right? It could be a highly proficient non-native speaker. And some of her students chose non-native speakers and found that to be very effective.
Right. Mirroring. Yeah, that's definitely something I want to look into after this interview. What about working? If you want to work on your pronunciation, is it better to work on individual sounds or on entire words, entire sentences?
Well, that depends on where your problems lie, right? So if you have certain segments that you're having difficulty with, then individual words are good, right? So you might use something like English Accent Coach. If you know that you have certain vowels that you have problems with, then you can work on them. But if you're just working at the word level, you're not going to get to suprasegmentals. That's not going to help you with stress or intonation or rhythm or speech rate, fluency, So really, I think that people probably need a little bit of everything, right? So going from the level of individual sounds to discourse level, because, ultimately your goal is going to be to communicate with other people in conversations. So that's going to be at the level of discourse. So for sure, if you've got specific segments that you have difficulty with, then yeah, practice them at the level of the segment and then the word. But eventually you're going to have to look at all these other aspects like suprasegmentals. And we know that they both contribute to intelligibility and comprehensibility, both segmentals and suprasegmentals. So you need to go well beyond the level of the word for that. And we've seen studies, for instance, where stress, for example, like word stress, if people give equal stress to every syllable in an utterance, they're going to be harder to understand in English than if they have stress in the appropriate place.
So great. Well, Tracey, this has been really great, very insightful. Once again, for the listeners, I'm going to put all of the takeaways from this interview on my website. I'll put a link in the description, louistaligram.com. And Tracey, thank you so much.